Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Scott Sugden. I am Product and Technology Outreach Manager here at L-Acoustics. We've got a great conversation with a couple of experts all about the Brit Awards and also broadly how broadcast live events work, specifically from a sound design perspective through operation, system calibration. I want to introduce my expert panel today, coming to us from slightly far away across the ocean, the Atlantic, Ben Phillips and Josh Lloyd. Thank you guys both very much for joining me today. Ben, how's everything? Where are you exactly? I forget where your house is, your home.
We're in sunny Scotland, in Glasgow, although today is not so sunny, being that it's Glasgow.
Yeah, so it's normal, is what you're saying. It's a normal day there.
Yeah, I mean, if I look out the window, it's the rain's coming down. It's it's another fine day here in summer in the UK.
That's great. And Ben, you've got a family of 4 children, 3 dogs, 2 cats, a fish, a gerbil, and
just the 2 boys.
Just the 2 boys. Excellent. Ben, I'm sure it's been great, obviously, spending time with the boys this many nights in a row. I was just saying to my wife the other day, we've never, since we've met, been together this many days in a row, which is wonderful and yet terrible not to be doing shows. But I guess if everything has a downside, there's at least an upside to it. Ben,
you're absolutely right.
You want to tell us a little bit? Obviously, you've been around the world touring, doing designs, working on all kinds of projects. What's your background a bit?
I'm originally from New Zealand many years ago. I started out there working for a PA company and then decided to spread my wings and move to the UK and continue within the music industry. And I was good enough to sort of get in with the likes of Britannia Row, who looked after me for a good long while. Met people like Josh and all the other people that work with them, and then from there embarked on, like you say, touring around the world several times with many famous, I guess, artists. Been quite lucky in that respect. Excellent,
Ben. I'm really glad you could join us. It's good to see you again. Obviously, we get to spend time together once every few months somewhere in the world. Yeah. This almost counts. We won't get to have a beer after this together, but we'll have to do that next time. Josh, you're just outside of London. Is that correct? Is this your home?
Correct. Yeah, I live just outside London in Windsor, UK. So, yeah, enjoying the rainy weather at the moment. We've had unseasonably hot UK weather, and now it's raining as to be expected on a June day in the UK.
Well, that sounds like you should be doing a festival right now, is what it seems like to me. So it's unfortunate, obviously, that we're not. But thank you for joining us. You have a young daughter. Should we listen for her, or are you in a studio space and well isolated?
I'm locked away and well isolated for the time being. So yeah.
Low risk there. Excellent. Well, thank you, Josh, for joining us. So today's conversation, we kind of picked this topic. It's about the Brit Awards, but I think it's going to be a bit more broad about the challenges that you face when you do a live event that also happens to be broadcast. Now, my background, I come mostly from live events. I've done a few broadcast things from time to time. Can you, Josh, explain to me what's really the main key differences between, say, a broadcast type event and a traditional live event?
I mean, the first thing is you have to be realistic or be honest with yourself when you start designing for these shows, in that we are lower in the pecking order than other parts of the show. I know that's the case with touring, but at the end of the day, when you have a TV audience of hundreds of thousands or maybe millions in some cases, the set, the look of the show takes priority. That being said, obviously the feel of what's going on in the room massively impacts how the audience behaves. So it's a trade-off in terms of getting a great result in the room, but also working within the constraints of the set design, the video, and other departments.
Is the sound system like a taboo? Is it allowed to even be seen these days, or do you have to literally hide it behind scenery and put it up so high that it couldn't possibly hit a camera shot?
In an ideal world, I think most show designers would, and I think this is the same from my experience of large touring productions these days as well. The PA is the thing they never want to see, but it's, as we know, it's the first thing people comment on when it's not right. So I think a big thing I've I've come to learn is the set designer is your friend. So if you can work alongside them and maybe massage that relationship so that you can potentially maybe integrate the PA system somehow, or at least have them conscious that there is a need for speakers in the room when you're designing a show.
Now, Ben, you've done a lot of these as well over the years, including several Brit Awards. You're talking, Josh is saying you want to be friends with the set designer, and I that makes sense to me, I guess. Obviously, like, hey, I need some real estate. And by the way, it's not just this Vectorworks file that you put in from 3 years ago that's the same thing. When does this process start? When do you get your first call on this? I'm assuming this is not just 3 weeks before the show starts, right? When does that process start?
In an ideal world, this process, it could start potentially months before the actual event, which gives you a lot of time to build those relationships, with like the set designers, with the lighting designers, etc. In order to gain the real estate that you require. I mean, like Josh said, there's always a conversation to be had about where the PA could go, or what the trim height might be, or how visible it might be, and perhaps that might also depend on, say, the look and the feel of the show. There may be some instances where they may want the PA to be seen, others where they may not. But like I say, this design process can start well in advance of the show, and to be honest, the more time you have and the better that relationship you have with those key members of the design team, the better I believe your end result will be.
So obviously it's months out, and this is obvious. I would imagine in the early stages of the show concept. Hey, we're doing the Brit Awards 2020, 2021. This year's show is about. Is there a major theme that you're trying to help with? I mean, are you a part of that creative process? And I'll throw this to you, Ben. Are you part of that creative process, like from the concept of the show, or is it more of a here's what we need to do? Is it more of a functional role?
I mean, from my own experience, certainly the majority of it has been sort of more functional in terms of delivering audio across the throughout the venue to all the audience who are in there. But at the same time, you do need to be conscious of the direction of what the show designers are going and looking at in terms of maybe the layout of the set, the layout of the seating, how that all fits into the show as a whole. Although there may be a concept for a particular show, I don't feel that we would potentially be involved in that too much, other than maybe say the look of the PA and how that fits in with that concept. For example, if it is say a bit more rock and roll, for want of a better word, they may want to see the speakers more. They may want to be quite a prominent feature. They may want to dress the speakers or in certain ways to make them fit in with the set more. So there are those sorts of conversations to be had early on as well.
And Josh, so being a part of that process, I would imagine there's something about what the show is, right? If this is an award show where actor is getting an award and the symphony plays them on and off, the needs and desires and wants of your sound design are different than an event that's based on live entertainment and live music and performance. Can you describe like what those paradigms might be and what your choices might be?
Very much so. I mean, using something like the Brit Awards or the MTV Music Awards, which are kind of two obvious examples I can think of. Obviously, there you have the trade-off that you have awards, you have speeches, which speech intelligibility is really important, and also not colouring the broadcast mix when you're designing a system for that kind of event. I mean, we've done weird and wonderful things like the Queen's Jubilee, which was her birthday, where there's everything from an orchestra to spoken, comedians and things in between. And they don't want to see the PA. It's got to almost be invisible. There's nowhere to fly it from. So obviously the considerations are specific to what the job is, and also the constraints perhaps that are given to you by the design team. Yeah,
and I guess that makes sense to me. And how much of your design impacts the broadcast? I guess I can see a couple things like, hey, we don't want to hear the PA, right? That's probably the simplest one, right? Like they want to have a studio environment, albeit with 20,000 people in a room.
I mean, firstly, I think it depends with the broadcast mixer. So some engineers who do broadcast mixes like to feel a lot of energy from the room. But obviously what you put into the room, you don't want it to colour it in a negative way. So, for example, a huge build-up of low end in the roof of the arena where all the audience mics are hanging is going to have an effect on that. So, for example, thinking about directivity in the low end of your system, perhaps. Equally, thinking about maybe where presentations are happening on the stage and how your system is going to interact with that in terms of, off-axis response of the system, whether you can perhaps zone the system. Sometimes you can't get away from the fact that you're going to have people in front of the audio system and perhaps coming at it from an angle that, okay, I'm going to zone the system so I can attenuate certain parts of the system at a given point in the show, and perhaps automate that within your console or within your workflow of the show. That's part of the design process.
Yeah, I suppose that makes a lot of sense, right? Like you start thinking about this from the very beginning, like we're going to have a podium here. We need to make sure we have a clean broadcast, good gain before feedback. And oh, by the way, we have to figure out a way to operate this so we don't forget to do what we need to do at that exact time, right? So in my thought process might be the exact same matrix output duplicate. However, I just send 3 of them to the PA so I can turn that one down for this one scene by X amount. Ben, is that a pretty common thing you see, like in these where you just start thinking about all the possible scenarios you could end up at?
Absolutely. I mean, we can certainly look at where different performers may be, or indeed, as Josh mentioned, the presenters. And I mean, the great thing about some of the L-Acoustics product range indeed includes Soundvision, and we can model all of these examples of how the PA could interact with different parts of the audience, or indeed the performance space. Which is a really handy feature, not only looking at the audio that comes out the front of the source, but also to the back or to the side, or indeed underneath.
Right. And where do you go, like, I mean, do we want to dig into a little bit of a design and just kind of start to understand this, and maybe take a look into some of this of how we might think about zoning, right? That's a first thought, and I guess we can think about it as a big level of maybe even array to array. We might think about it front fill zoning. I would imagine you might want to know the blocking, several weeks before the show. You're going to want to know the concept blocking for where the presenters are going to be, where the artists are going to be. Ben, do you often?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, knowing those positions of where bands may be. I mean, there may be multiple stages. There may be A stages, B stages, presenter stages, and I guess you're given an initial example of where these locations may be, but also in the back of your mind, you need to retain a bit of flexibility and think, well, actually, sure, they've planned it to be here, but as we all know, come rehearsals, or when they start to block it or run it through, suddenly the director may decide, actually, I prefer these people to perform over here, or we're having a change of script and they'll perform from somewhere else. So the ability to configure your speaker system in terms of zoning and inputs and outputs on the fly is something you need to build into your design, as well as your thought process and managing it on the day.
Josh, this actually, it's funny, when I hear Ben say that, it makes me think of the way a mixer might approach going into production rehearsal with a band. Like saying, I need to have the flexibility in my console to make a pivot for when they decide that musically this song is going to have this instrument. I need to have headroom in my channel counts and my plugins, my inserts. But usually a band or a pop show doesn't have to think about that from a PA perspective very often. It's just the PA, it's reproducing sound. The rest of it is kind of downstream, doesn't matter. And now for these shows, it sounds like you have to think about that from a mix perspective. Okay, I need to have the ability to pivot, and a PA perspective. Is that a good analogy, you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy. I mean, I think Ben hit on a really key point there. Quite often on these shows, we'll have a meeting maybe a week and a half out. So it's quite close to the show where they kind of have a show running order in terms of the blocking of presenters, performers, and obviously by that point the design's already happened. So I think a key point is when you're doing the design is to build in flexibility, to having the ability to zone certain areas, and equally, whenever you're putting loudspeaker sources into your design, just having a think about not only the behavior in front of the loudspeaker, but as Ben said, off axis. So you've got flexibility in terms of your routing of your signal from console through to each zone, and also your design has kind of thought about the effect of the speakers in various positions in the room. Yeah,
and I see this. Is this Ben? Is this you sharing it right now? Is that what I see?
Yeah. So I've just got a small example of what we're talking about here, of looking at not only the output at the front of the speaker, but also consider what is happening behind or possibly underneath the speaker. And if we zoom in here a bit to our singer, for example, we can see that there is quite a lot of high frequency here spilling down to where their microphone may be. And this may cause us a gain before feedback issue. So we could look at perhaps raising the speaker or altering it somewhat, but we also can still see in this case that our chosen speaker source is still putting quite a bit of energy onto the stage. So then perhaps we could look at a different source, and straight away we can see, just by changing the source, we can see how we've greatly reduced the amount of spill, if you like, back into where the performance area may be. And this could be with a band, it could be presenters, you could be working with a singer who doesn't generate much noise themselves.
Yeah, sure.
Or somebody with like a lav, for example. So these are all things to consider, and with Soundvision you can quite easily model this.
Now I see this and I look at that, and is this much different, your logic of gain before feedback, from any traditional show? Are you more sensitive to certain frequencies because of broadcast, or is this the same?
I think initially you are drawn to maybe looking at it in a bit more detail for a TV show where it's not only going out to, say, 20,000 people in your arena, but maybe hundreds of thousands or millions when it's broadcast. However, I feel, and I still do this myself, give it the same attention when looking at a live show, whether it be a small club show or a smaller theatre, or through to a stadium or an arena tour. These are all still concepts that you can explore and pay definite interest to, particularly when it comes to positioning your speakers.
Got it. Now, looking at that, obviously, I see, like that second design, you have a pretty big distance from the stage to the first row, and in a lot of these events, they have either some grandiose staircase up to the stage, or they have the most important people in the first row, or of course it's the exact opposite. It's the least important people who are the energy for the TV shot, right? So it's one of those two things in the front row. Does that, I mean, I hate to say this, does that impact how you design? If you know that it's just the extras in the first few rows, are you as concerned about them from an audio perspective, or do you need to make sure that they feel the show?
And my own personal perspective is I believe everybody, regardless of how much they paid for a ticket, or whether they're a celebrity or a friend of a friend or friend of the band, whatever, they all deserve equally good audio. And I will try as hard as I can to deliver quality audio to all of those seats throughout the venue. Whether you've paid $200 for a ticket or $50 for a ticket. To me, it all matters. That said, you need to obviously work within the constraints of the show, particularly if it's a TV event. And you mentioned areas down in front of the stage, which can be difficult to position front fills along the stage or in front of the stage, or in those difficult areas where there are stairs or walkways, which are obviously in camera shot, and it can be very difficult at times to get the required speakers, the number of speakers you want, but also in the best position for you audio-wise. It can be very difficult to get those in there.
And Josh, you were talking, I think when we were starting to think about this conversation about the Brit Awards specifically, they're really going for an excited, dynamic show. They really want to engage that audience, and I believe it's not just a room filled with celebrities and sponsor ticket giveaways. There's people paying to be at this performance, right?
Yeah, so I mean, the Brits is an interesting one because you have quite a diverse audience. You've got young people from the Brit School who are potential future artists. So we have the likes of Adele and other artists who've come through the Brit School, but they're the audience that are in shot at the front of the stage, giving the event some energy. Then you've obviously got all the tables in the room, which are record executives, artists themselves, so people from the industry, potentially some of our clients. And then around the arena, you've got people who've paid upwards of, hundreds of pounds for tickets to come to the show. So as Ben said, I'm very much of the same mind as Ben. Everybody in the room deserves to get the best quality audio possible when you're designing the system. And you hit on an interesting point there as well. This year we had a new director, and one of the things he really saw, which added to the show, was the energy in the room, so how the audience responded. And a big part of how the audience react is how the audio and the energy is in the room. So if you're making huge compromises on the audio system, you are going to you're going to lose out that vibe and that energy in the room, and that's going to reflect on camera because people aren't going to be feeling it as much. So I think that's quite an important point to consider. And it was interesting anecdotally. I'll just add this. This year, I don't know if people are familiar with these types of shows. There's quite often ad breaks in them, and this year in the room they actually removed the ad breaks to keep that energy going in the room. So it's something they thought was really important, to the show.
Right. Yeah, I've been to a couple of broadcast events, both as someone who's working and then some for entertainment, and it's always interesting. They go to the commercial break and all the producers run up on stage and redo the makeup, and everyone sits around for 90 seconds or 3 minutes, and it's pretty boring. The better events have a comedian come out and give you 4 minutes of jokes to keep you enjoying yourself and being smiling, entertaining. So when the camera comes back on, you're ready to go again. But there's nothing worse than that live event where the producer tells everyone to get excited again, we're going to camera, and trying to get the crowd to pretend like this is the best experience of their life. That's really interesting. Now, how loud was it at the Brits this year? I mean, is this a normal concert level SPL? Is this normal, or is this reduced or increased? I mean, what's the scenario you're thinking about performance wise?
Well, the interesting thing is obviously we try and give each artist the same, level playing field in terms of energy, obviously taking into account, what the source material is. But, normally the show would sit somewhere around 99, 100 for the music elements, and maybe the stings and things in between. And obviously, speech is kind of quieter, kind of 96, 97 perhaps, depending on how much level the engineer on the production desk can achieve.
Yeah, can you elaborate a bit on the system design for this year's show or past shows, and maybe how it's evolved over time as well?
Yeah, so if I endeavour to share my screen. So a big thing this year that was different to previous years was quite often we have performers out in the middle of the arena and they're performing in front of the PA, sometimes 40 metres from the system, which from their point of view is obviously quite strange because there's a huge delay from the system, the time of arrival to their ears. Also for the audience, they're looking at the performer at one end of the room, but hearing the sound from the other end.
Right.
And in terms of the broadcast mix, you also got plenty of open mics in front. Yeah. So one thing we looked at this year was actually putting a secondary system in at the other end of the room, kind of in the round configuration. And that was interesting for two reasons. Firstly, it really helped with things like game before feedback, the amount of energy going back down the mics for broadcast. But also, it was interesting that in the room, the audience actually, it felt far more immersive. They'd actually move around to look. And there was actually a moment in the show where we had a performer on one end of the arena who traversed down the arena to the other end. So we actually, we used some delay automation to actually move the performer from one end of the room to the other.
To help the audience. Help the audience trigger to that and get that camera shot with everyone doing this. That's great. Yeah, and if you watch it on camera, you can really see the reaction of the audience, and it was quite a big moment in the show. So
that's one part where it's evolved quite a lot. Kind of.
Yeah. I think Josh, you had that model. I think are we still seeing Ben's screen? I think at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. Because I think it's actually really interesting to think about this. We often put ourselves in constraints for live events where this is the PA, and we'll deal with the challenges as they exist. Here we go. So, all right. So you have a big main stage with a mostly traditional PA on one end.
Yeah, correct. So, I mean, a normal year, this is kind of what you'd be looking at. We have, as you say, a traditional main system.
Yep.
Quite often that system can be a lot higher than it was this year. I mean, this year we managed to get it down to an almost sensible height of it was 11.8 meters to the bottom of the main PA.
That's almost traditional concert height these days, right? Like a bottom of the PA at 10, 11, 12 meters. That's probably been one of the big evolutions, kind of getting the PA down lower, and that has had an effect on the broadcast sound, because obviously when you're trimming the PA so high, obviously there's only a degree, so much of a degree of directivity in the low end and the low mid, and you're putting a lot of that energy up into the roof where they have a large amount of audience mics. So I know, talking to the broadcast team, the broadcast engineer, that's something that's had quite a big impact on how much it's colouring their broadcast mix. Sure.
And then obviously from the perspective in the room, just the image is in front of you rather than somewhere up in the up in the roof there. And just in terms of consistency across the listening area, we've been able to get it a lot more consistent now in terms of coverage and tonal balance across the room. So that's kind of how we've been for several years. Like I say, the trim height has altered. A couple of years ago we managed to get the subs into the middle and get them off the floor, and that's benefited us in several ways. Obviously, all the obvious things like coverage is, the coverage of the low end is far more even now, getting it up off the floor. But one big thing is actually the coupling of the subs to the ground and things like camera tracks.
Yeah.
We had real issues, as you can imagine, with cameras, the back focus being knocked out on cameras by subs, and by lifting them off the floor and becoming more reliant on the flown subs than ground subs, it's really helped keep the low end energy in the room like you would have with a traditional rock or pop concert.
And I would imagine you're fighting for every millimeter inch of real estate at the front of the stage. So to say, by the way, I need to put a block of subwoofer, you're the lowest man on that totem pole, I'd imagine. So you put them 40, 50, 60, 70 feet from center. I
think it goes lighting, set, confetti, catering,
stage management, comms, camera grip, and then maybe sound is there at that point.
Somewhere there.
Yeah. No, I mean, and it's interesting too. It doesn't look like a exorbitant count of subwoofer, because what venue is this? This is quite a large venue, is it?
This is the O2 in London, which I guess is comparable to an A market arena in the US.
Yeah, so this is 15 to 20,000 people in a venue.
Yeah. So. And we do have a flown delay system, which we've been doing for a few years. So 4 hangs of delays. Their position is dependent on other
departments,
show elements, because the big thing with this show is the design does vary from year to year, so it's not the same set design each year, so there can be quite drastic variations on what we're dealing with from year to year. So it is a kind of fresh approach. So if you've made some traction one year with getting the PA lower, you kind of almost have to start again the following year. So
and I suppose the delay elements are both because the venue's large and it helps. The second thing is, for those who have never done many of these events before, but you think that lighting departments are annoying at a normal traditional concert where there might be one little stick of truss in front of your PA. At these, there's more lighting and trussing over the audience than you've ever seen in your life. And by the way, their positions are more important than yours. So how much PA would that, or how much truss would the PA traditionally shoot through to get to the back? It is probably quite a lot. And it looks like they have delay video as well. Is that correct? IMAG? Yes, there's IMAGs around the room. So we also have to take into consideration fitting the IMAGs between the loudspeaker hangs. So, there's quite a few considerations in terms of obstructions in the way of the PA. Now, what about camera? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Go ahead, Josh.
No, I was just going to say, sometimes obviously you do have to accept that potentially there are going to be obstructions, but it's kind of making the best compromise in terms of how you approach design.
And I imagine you also need to know that all the camera shots they want. And I would imagine at a broadcast event, there's how many cameras at this? 30 to 40 potentially on some of the bigger ones.
Yeah, and often things like spider cams, which obviously have wires that run through it. So if people aren't familiar, spider cams, what you see often at sporting events, it's on 4 wires and it can traverse around using those.
Oh, so you have to keep everything clear for that.
Yeah, so that's also something else. It's an obstruction that's moving, so it's not even a fixed target that you're working with.
Now I'm just thinking like let me pivot my head from design to integration or implementation of this. Josh and Ben, both of you have installed in a part of not just the design stage, but the on-site crew that integrates this. So I'm a designer and I come up with a grandiose design. A lot of ways I don't care how certain things are done, right? I don't care which way you choose to run the cable. And I see it looks like you're flying amp racks on this. Is that a conscious choice, or is that almost a means to the end, kind of a scenario? Josh, I'll let you start with this, but why is that? Is it a rational choice? Is it just,
A few issues. First issue is potentially the cable runs can be very, very long, and also, I mean, this Soundvision drawing only shows a fraction of the truss. If I jump across here, this is a CAD model. Hopefully you can see that. There's a lot of truss in the roof, and the problem is audio often comes in later than other show elements. So you have the potential for your cables to get trapped in. So that's also another consideration. But the main consideration is the length of speaker cable. You're potentially talking upwards of 100 meters of speaker cable if you're not flying the amps on top of them.
Yeah.
So
I suppose you're not getting an amp location directly below the PA, are you? In that scenario. Now that's got to be a penalty, though. I mean, imagine even a venue like the O2, which has a colossal capacity for weight and rigging. Flying amp racks is heavy. How does that impact? What's the tech department? What's the technical director think of this when you say, I'm flying these amps, they're heavy, sorry, I need it, right? Is that a conscious choice, or is that a problem?
Well, it's an interesting one, because several years we've been flying them for a while now. Many years ago, we were pulling up large CACOM looms up into the roof, which wasn't much fun. So we started flying the amps, and what's been interesting is each year we've had kind of the rigging department, because this show's really heavy. They actually put in a huge ground support to actually take a lot of the video elements, because the roof can't physically take the load of the show. So any weight savings they can achieve, they'll try to do. So I've been approached, can you not fly the amps? Obviously that's adding quite a bit of weight into the roof. And what's interesting is when you add the weight of the cable bridge required, the motors, the long 4mm socket PEX or CACOM cable, the actual offset is that it's heavier with
That's funny, isn't it? It's funny,
cables and the motors and the truss than it is having amplifiers on top of the bumps.
Sure, it's always interesting when that happens. That it turns out the weight's, at best it's even, right? And sometimes it's actually, let's say, cheaper in weight to just fly the amps and put them up there. And I suppose for the riggers, it's like, hey, we just need 2 big points as opposed to I need 6 or 8 or 10 to deal with all the cable management this is. That's interesting. So Ben, on site, you've got a great design. Obviously, we've got the main stage PA. I see this. In this case, Josh, you had a second PA as well.
Yeah, so let me switch that on.
How does the workflow, Ben, go from step A, B, C, D when you have all this stuff? I'd imagine you get a full 24 hours of audio dark time to tune with. Is that correct, Ben?
A chance would be a fine thing there, Scott. Tuning a system of this size and of this magnitude, and indeed of such importance for quite a prestigious show, the amount of tuning time you may have can be quite limited, and often there are very short windows in which to be able to do this. Some examples are when everybody goes for their meal break, for example, to lunch. then that's when the PA crew, the system engineers will stay behind and use that quiet time where nobody's working to get some measurements and to do some time alignment, to listen to the system and fine tune it then if possible. And in terms of workflow, I mean the workflow of the L-Acoustics equipment and software and how it all ties together, that ecosphere, if you like, makes that job so much easier. I mean, a huge time savings to be had with the way that the products all interlock and integrate with each other. So, you know, you may only have an hour or two for that meal break, for example, but you can certainly get a lot done these days using the workflow that L-Acoustics can present.
So Josh, this is your design. Is this the 2019 system or is this the 2020 system here?
This is 2020, so this is actually the last gig before lockdown.
So this is your last gig. So at least you went out with a good one. You know, I mean, it could have been a unexciting show, but this is great. Now, I would imagine, Josh, was a lot of this, Ben's talking about what you can do in advance. So what's your checkbox of things that need to get done in implementation? What was done in advance? What was done on site? How can you balance those two?
So, you know, as Ben's touched on, the L-Acoustics ecosystem does help massively. Obviously, during the pre-production period, we've done all the design side of it, integrating with the set, drawing CAD models and kind of sharing that information between departments. Once the design's kind of nailed in Soundvision in terms of positions, you know, there's so many great tools. There's the ability to use the auto solvers. There's the ability to look at the FIR filters, EQ, delay, essentially kind of get the system to a really good start point from within Soundvision. And now we can port that across into LA Network Manager. So we've already started with quite a lot of the work that perhaps used to happen on site with measurement. It's done offline without causing any inconvenience to anyone on site. Also, if things change on site, you know, if perhaps we don't manage to achieve a trim height because, you know, there's something that on the drawing someone hasn't thought about and, you know, we have to change things, you can go back into Soundvision, you can adjust stuff, you can reflect the reality, you know, so what am I actually doing on the show, what have I had to change, input that into Soundvision, update that data and re-import that into LA Network Manager. So that immediately is a huge time saver. And then this year, obviously, is the first year we've used M1, which means we can then start looking at doing measurements in a less obtrusive way. So whereas perhaps, as Ben touched on, you know, dinner time was the only time we could make noise. Now with the sweeps and with the workflow in M1, we can kind of get away with doing quite a lot more work while other departments are working. So people can be banging away on truss. People can be up in the roof, and actually it's not, unless someone's in front of a cluster, it's not really obtrusive to their what they're doing. So that's really beneficial to us, and that's become a huge time saver for us.
Did you this year with those impulse sweep measurements, did you even notify everyone, or was it something that you kind of like sneak in and no one even, they just heard that was kind of bizarre, what was that just happening? You know.
Well, interestingly, we always ask, because obviously there's potentially other people in the roof, or you know, in the roof doing things, or someone doing something with pyro. So we check, and this year we actually checked if it was okay, and we got a call on the radio a bit later asking if we were going to start tuning the PA because they hadn't realised we'd begun already. So I think that kind of speaks volumes to the success of that platform. And I mean, obviously there are other platforms out there that work in a similar way, but they don't have the same workflow that M1 does in terms of being able to work offline and manipulate the system within the M1 platform and then send that data straight to the amps. So you know, that's been I don't know, it's been
so Josh,
effect on stuff for us.
Obviously, you did the sound design for the 2020 Brit Awards. You also mixed the show. I'm trying to figure out where you were in this room, because you had two giant PAs that are both facing different directions. So where was mix at? I'm assuming it was perfectly right in the middle between them, right?
Exactly. No, we're down here in this bottom corner, so you can see a very useful set of X8s pointing at me there.
That was your reference monitors. So
yeah, which to be honest, To be honest, I try not to use those during the show. Obviously, with this system here, I was slightly off axis, but it works very well.
How many? I'm just curious on this. How many inputs did you have live? How many desks? How many mixers? Are you doing the entire mix, or do you break this up a bit?
No, so we have on most of these shows we have at least 2 consoles out front. There's actually 4 consoles because we have redundancy, but there's 2 engineers, and one engineer will focus on the production elements, so the presenters, the VTs, grams, things like that between, award winners, kind of acceptance speeches. And the other console, which is the one I operate, solely focuses on the performance side, so the bands. So whilst perhaps awards are going on, we're line checking and preparing for the next artist who's going to go on stage.
Got it. Wow. And I'm assuming you have a pretty broad team, because I'm thinking, okay, you have 2 at front of house. You don't get to leave front of house, right? You don't get to go walk around and listen to the system. So how big is the systems engineering team? And then you've got how many guys backstage? And that's just the live side of this, right? We've got broadcast, we've got monitors. I'm assuming is there a dedicated record team as well?
Yeah, so there's actually 2 record teams. So there's in terms of the live audio, so the team from Britannia Row in the room, we've got 2 main system engineers, so a fantastic system engineer called Sergey, and a guy called Robbie. So those 2 guys kind of oversaw the whole PA. They've got a team of 4 system engineers who works alongside with them, flying and deploying all the system and dealing with the many jobs that are ongoing during the rehearsal period and the loading. Then there's 2 monitor engineers. There's a patch team on stage of about 5 people, 2 RF engineers, and then there's the whole broadcast team that's separate to us. So there is a team that deal with the production sides, the same as we divide the workflow out front. There's a production team that deal with presenters, grams, award winners, acceptance speeches, any link ups to any off-site stuff, and then we have the music truck, which just deals with the music mix for TV.
I mean, just thinking about that management at front of house, are you wearing one comm headset, one radio headset? You got your locals, you've got your band council, plus your backup band council. I'm just trying to think through this. Or do you have someone with you? Is there a stage manager or producer sitting with you as well to help coordinate that functionality?
So both the engineers out front who are mixing, we have a feed of the director so we can hear what's going on during the show. And then we have a shout system. So we have a local self-powered monitor, and we can talk from our console back to the rest of the stage team. And also if we need to, we can talk to the director and to the OB truck. So during the show, the guy doing the production mix would listen mainly to the director to take his cues. And all the microphone handouts in terms of presenters, award winners is all choreographed ahead of time. So unless something changes, we've had years where, Liam Gallagher's thrown a presenter mic out into the audience, so they've had to change the order perhaps of the presenter microphones. Unless that changes, they'll just go as per script.
Sure.
If not, there's a team of people handing out mics on the floor from broadcast who'll update that engineer. And then in terms of what I listen to when I'm mixing the bands, I mainly focus on listening to the audio crew who are line checking and preparing. And generally, there's an introduction to a band, so that's a pretty good cue to go. And I also have the director.
And how many?
Sorry. Go on.
Oh no, I was just going to say you've got bands, and this year, how many live acts did you have? Was it 5 or 6, or was it 15 or 20?
I think it was 9 acts this year we had, I believe, from memory. Yeah.
And did each one get their own dedicated inputs, and your Digico or your Yamaha or whatever desk have enough inputs for that, or did you have to festival patch this, if you will, and recall sessions and scenes?
So we kind of run a bit of a hybrid system. So band inputs, things from stage, because the risers have to be unplugged and rolled away. They have a kind of shared system, so what we call a flip-flop system, so we can A/B flip between them. So band 1 is on system A, band 2 is on system B, and so on. And then in terms of radio mics, we have dedicated patch system and microphones for each artist. So they're radio mics and their spares and any any BV mics, that kind of thing, are all dedicated to the artist.
Got it.
So in total, I think we're a few hundred inputs
For the band
inputs.
Side of it.
Yeah, if you add all the bands together and the radio and the playback and that kind of thing, it's somewhere in that region, I think.
Okay, and that's not, is that including the broadcast? Because then the broadcast, you've got another whole world of stuff, or is that several hundred inputs total between everybody?
That's total. So
Okay.
Broadcast is fairly sensible. It's like 32 inputs, I think. It's mainly presenter mics, so then grams and that kind of things that come back.
Now, who's feeding whom? Do you feed the broadcast desk then a certain number of stems, or is it, just literally a left-right at that point you're feeding?
No, so we actually both feed multiple feeds into the system. So as we discussed earlier, the system's quite heavily zoned, and obviously our needs are different. So whereas the engineer on the production console might need to isolate part of the system pointing at the presenter podium, or maybe do some EQ for feedback, I potentially don't need to have that flexibility. So we have different zones, but we both feed into the PA directly.
Got it.
And then we also take a backup mix from the OB truck that deals with our equivalent. So I'll take a backup of the presenter OB truck, and the presenter front of house console will take a backup of the band truck. So there's kind of multiple layers of redundancy. Yeah.
And Ben, in designing these, you weren't in 2020 Brit Awards, but you've done a number of these shows and the MTV Awards and other ones over the years. I'm just thinking in my head, you've got a system matrix in the master that sits between all this that's got to be quite large. I mean, how many inputs do you have, and traditionally how many outputs do you have in that kind of a setup?
I mean, it's going back to what we spoke about earlier about building in flexibility and the ability to not foresee issues, but to certainly be able to tackle them once you're on site. Part of that flexibility certainly revolves around the matrixing side of things. Typically, we've used matrices which are, for example, say 64 in, 32 out, or indeed 64 by 64, depending on the bit of kit available. But it certainly pays to think about the zoning, like Josh mentioned, not only for the band, but also from the presenter side as well, for each source that you may have, or indeed, if you know someone will be directly underneath a certain part of an array, have that zoned and introduced into that matrix system as well. Flexibility is the key.
Yeah, and then the other aspect, I'm thinking you've got this comm and shout aspect. Is comm, now I know in different shows comm becomes an audio job or it becomes a different team. Is comm in your worldview, Ben, or is that you just have a whole comm team that deals with that?
I think typically it's been something that we have dealt with as an audio department. I mean, as Josh pointed out, we have the shout system, which is purely so we can all communicate with each other. There may be a comm system, if you like, as a sort of backup, the traditional sort of headset, if you like, that would go back between stage and front of house. That side of comms, I think we would take care of internally within the audio department. If we look towards a sort of wider comm system, for example, which would take into account TV, broadcast, etc., that is typically taken care of by the broadcast or the TV or the camera guys, because they tend to use it a lot more. They may give us a base station, which we will listen into. We'll be able to hear the director or different feeds, for example, as Josh mentioned. But they primarily look after that side of things.
And Ben, pardon me, at the past events you've been involved in, your role has been on the system design and systems engineer role, or you've mixed the broadcast, or you've mixed the live mics. What's your role?
Oh goodness. So I've done the system design, in the system tech on site. I've done front of house. I've even been a monitor engineer on several shows. I've done a bit of everything, and I think the ability to do that is important because it gives you a taste of what each department values, and you can then use those that insight to feed that into your PA design. Doing some monitors, you realise how much effect the PA may have in certain parts of the stage or the performance area. Same too with doing front of house, the importance of how the PA is set up and optimizing it, and that can then feed into your next design and future designs.
That's really cool. And I was looking online. There's been a few questions coming in. If you guys are watching live on Teams right now, please don't hesitate to send us some questions. We'll see if we can discuss those things. There was a bit of interest, obviously, into like the channel count. We kind of talked about that. How's the system distributed network-wise? Is this just analog audio? I would imagine that's probably not a good choice for the cable paths we're talking about. Is this networked audio? What kind of flexibility do you have in that? Josh, I'll let you jump on that first.
I can potentially share my screen with you. So, I mean, as I've kind of mentioned, redundancy is a huge part of this show. So this is kind of a very basic schematic of this year's show. I mean, we have a pair of consoles for band and for presenter. And then each console would follow multiple paths into the system processing. So we have, for example, the band console feeds both MADI and AES into the processor, so that if one output unit were to fail, another output unit could take over. And likewise, the same from the presenter consoles. There's an analog and an AES signal path. And then down to stage, we use audio over IP, but then we also use MADI, which gets converted to analog to do analog redundancy. So there's multiple signal paths. Also, anything that has one power supply, there's a duplicate of it on a UPS, so that if we lose power, at least when the power comes back up, we're not waiting for all the signal infrastructure to restart. Or if we lose power at, say, a node point, audio would continue running everywhere. It's quite a lot to think about, obviously, in terms of aligning all your signal paths, that kind of thing. But redundancy is the key on a show like this, because we can't really afford to lose audio at any point.
Right, and I always think about that from a redundancy perspective. Is failure is going to happen eventually, right? So depending on the scale and scope of the show, you just have to decide what redundancy is necessary. If it's a live event for 500 people, maybe rebooting a processor in 2 minutes is okay. If it's a live broadcast for 5 million, maybe instantaneous seamless audio transfer so nobody hears anything is the best choice, and that's going to really scale your design. I would imagine then you end up with effectively 2 of every single thing in the system, and all of it interlinked and automated, so when it fails, or I should say not if but when it fails, you don't have to press a button, it just happens on its own, right? That's the objective.
Yeah, I mean, things like the LA12X are great, because if they lose the AES input, they automatically switch over. Obviously, moving forward in future years with AVB, we've obviously got 2 AVB connections, and then we can have AES or analog going in as well. So, sure. In a lot of ways, AVB will enable us to do this level of redundancy in a slightly more simple manner.
Sure. Yeah, because right now you're having a media convert from digital network audio back to AES to get in there. So that makes a lot of sense. And I would imagine this design evolves over time as well, that you've figured out a really good solution, and maybe what X percentage changes year after year to improve both the quality, the ease of use, the reliability, the need, right? It's not necessarily redesigned fresh ground up every time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously we do a lot of these types of shows, and it's always an evolution of how to approach them. And obviously the emergence of new technologies obviously makes it easier year on year as new bits of kit come available that enrich our workflow. Yeah.
So, Josh, I'm going to kick this one to Ben real quick, because I know you've been on all sides of this here. Someone was just wondering, you're modeling the shows. You've got, obviously, Josh was showing a really cool one with a bunch of round tables and all of this. Are you modeling in Soundvision, or do you actually model somewhere else in a modeling environment and use, like, say, SketchUp as an import?
I think it depends on the complexity of the venue or the show that you are looking to design. Certainly, Soundvision is a very capable tool of which you can model pretty much any piece of geometry you may wish to. There are other routes you can go down. For example, you mentioned SketchUp, Scott, which is a fantastic tool to draw some perhaps more intricate parts, or you could import a CAD drawing directly into there, manipulate that whether that be position or scale or indeed layers, or create other bits of geometry that you can then import into SketchUp, into Soundvision. So there are several paths you can take. Again, it also depends what information you have available, whether you are able to get some plans from the design team, or whether you need to go and seek those out yourself. Yeah, it depends what you have on hand. It depends on the complexity of the show that you're dealing with.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, Soundvision is a very capable tool, as you said, but it's not intended to replace all those layers or all those bits or all those pieces. So it definitely makes sense to me, and I completely agree with you to think about, you know, using that maybe that 3D modeler and use SketchUp. Those of you who are on YouTube right now or watching us live, I'll put a note. I'll put a link in the show notes about advanced room modeling. We've actually got a webinar we did maybe 2 months ago about how to import from, say, AutoCAD or Vectorworks into SketchUp and into Soundvision. Because I'd also imagine we get that 3D model, Josh, that you've got a beautiful one. I probably don't care about every detail there, do I?
It's very much about being selective about what's going to impact your design. So you can see here, obviously, there's a whole load of detail, set detail, you know, ground support detail, things that aren't going to affect my design. So I'm generally quite selective about what I import into Soundvision, and whether that's via SketchUp, which, as Ben said, is really useful and speeds up the workflow, or whether that's manually copying things using the drawing tools within Soundvision itself and just getting that information from a 3D model.
Got it. And Josh, this one's for you. There's someone, Chris was asking, and I think this is unnerving for people who haven't done broadcast or television shows before, but you're mixing every band. They all have their own staff. So how does that work? You know, how do you interact with them? Are they allowed to touch anything, or is this an advisory role?
So this is an interesting thing. I know the Grammys, being kind of, I guess, our counterpart in the US, don't allow people to mix. We generally, you know, most people are interested in going to the truck because it's the larger audience, so most engineers will by default go there. A lot of the engineers, you know them from touring with them, from, you know, them turning up year on year with artists doing these shows. So you build up a relationship and trust. So often they're happy for you to mix the show anyway. But generally, you know, if someone really wants to mix, we will allow them to. But the big thing with the show is obviously having consistency across the whole show. So someone who comes in with an artist has their artist's interests, whereas we have the interests of the whole show. So we want the whole show to sound great, but in terms of kind of a sonic signature and a kind of level across the show, you know, we kind of perhaps have a wider view of how it should sound. And
I suppose from a mixer perspective, you only have to learn one song, right? You don't have to learn an entire album worth of or catalog worth of their specific music. So you just need to know the specifics of the one song they're performing on a given night.
Yeah, and the great thing, you know, as technology's developed with, for example, the Digico platform which we use, people can send us desk files, and although we run one file, for example, out front, we can import presets, so we can build the session to look very familiar to the engineer who's walking up and have all his settings in there. And then, you know, in terms of you unmute it, you're in a good start point anyway for them, and that's been a real development in recent years with that. Certainly with the Digico platform, it's very easy to do that, to just import one band's data into a file.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. And you're right. Like, I'm used to the events in the U.S. where at the Grammys or on Saturday Night Live or on a lot of these events, you know, the live mix is done by one person who is not with the band, and the broadcast mix is done by one person who is not with the band. So yeah, the band's engineer usually ends up spending a lot of time in the truck making sure that it represents their artist in the correct way, or the band's engineer and the band's manager and the band's girlfriend or boyfriend and the band's mom and dad, and everybody's in the truck to make sure that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a trust thing on all sides. Yeah. You know, I'm sure I know, having been on the other side, being with touring with an artist, you can go into shows and maybe you don't get the result you want. with someone else mixing it. And inversely, you know, you can have an artist who comes in with someone who potentially doesn't have the experience of that kind of show. So it's about just, you know, feeling out the situation and trust on both sides. You know, at the end of the day, everyone involved just wants the best result possible, and it's about achieving that.
Yeah, it makes sense. That's really great. I'm really interested in obviously how all this works, and I know we've had a great bit of conversation. You know, the last thing I think that makes sense to us. So we've done this great design, Josh and Ben, over the years. We've evolved that design. We've installed the system over the course of a day or two and gotten to calibrate it. How much stick time do you get? How many rehearsals are there? Is it dependent? Like, let's just use Brits 2020. How much rehearsal was there for the show?
Typically on a Brit show, there's 3 days of rehearsal. However, a large part of that is sat round waiting for something to happen, because obviously they'll do a take. You'll normally get maybe a half-hour, 1 hour slot to sound check with each new artist to kind of get things dialed in, get the artist happy, get ourselves happy, and then we hand over to cameras, and it's dependent on the artist, on the look of that song in that show on that year. You know, some artists take longer and can work late into the night, naming no names, and some artists come out, you know, some rock and roll bands come out, play the song and want to get off there as quick as possible. So it's down to the artist. But we normally get 3 days, so we'll do 4 bands per rehearsal day, and then the third day is dress rehearsals, and then the shows at the end of that day.
Got it. Okay. And I'd imagine this isn't like we've all worked for artists who never show up to rehearsal or sound check. I suppose that doesn't happen in this environment, does it?
It has been known to happen. There have been artists who the first words you hear out of their mouth are live to air, and that does happen, which is always disconcerting.
Yeah, I can only imagine. You know, I've mixed a cold show or two in my life, and that's nerve-wracking for 5,000 people. But a cold show to millions and millions and millions, you're nervous live. I can only imagine what the guys and gals in the truck are feeling at that exact moment, that downbeat. Well, Ben, Josh, this has been great. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do this. I don't know if you had any closing points. I have one last question I'm going to ask you. I'm going to put you on the spot. I apologize. But I don't know if you guys had anything we wanted to hit before that last question.
No.
You feel good?
I think we've successfully covered quite a lot, really. Yeah, it's been quite thorough. Yeah.
Good. Well, I'm going to go to you first, Josh. You've been in the industry for a few years. You've seen a few things. Is there anything iconic for you? Is there anything that's been transformative for you from a technology perspective that makes your job easier, your job better, your job different?
Oh, there's quite a few, but probably the obvious kind of 2 for me would be, I probably touched on it earlier, digital consoles, not necessarily just the advent of them, but in terms of the functionality and workflow has improved so much on them. So, you know, I touched on the Digico consoles and the ability to load preset files. You also saw the schematic, the scope of formats that you can connect in and out of a lot of the console ecosystems now is great. And then probably the other big one I think we've shown here during this session today is modeling, you know, Soundvision modeling software, and, you know, probably as a whole, I would say the L-Acoustics ecosystem, because it is, you know, on a show like this, it gets you, you know, miles ahead of where you would have been a few years ago before it existed.
Yeah, and I totally with you on that, the 3D modeling aspect. I mean, it's funny, I remember designing, I know, Ben, for sure you know this, and Josh, you know this, PAs in Excel spreadsheets. And I remember hanging PAs with nothing more than how many knuckles I had between the speaker boxes, right? And what's funny to me is I thought those shows were really successful. So either it doesn't take as much rocket science, or my memory of what is a good performance has changed over the years. And I think it's probably more the second half. So I totally am with you on the 3D modeling aspect of, I don't know how to do a show without it, right? When I hear people, you know, winging it on a PA setup, I'm like, my head just explodes. It doesn't make sense to me. So that's really interesting. And digital consoles, I remember mixing monitors for an Easter service in early 2000s on an analog desk that had, you know, scene memory and fader recall. and having 2XL, whatever set up with all of this. And it was astronomical that I could just map this R&B service, with 100 inputs and then all of a sudden you get to mix on a Digico and you can do snapshots and recall every parameter and have 350 inputs and a million other things. And to go back to splitting inputs because you don't have enough on the desk seems really interesting.
I did once do a multi-band show on a Heritage 3000, having two Heritages, having to manually recall between artists with the LED lights. That was interesting.
Yeah, I remember when someone first taught me to mix monitors on Matrix, and I was like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "You got 24 aux on this desk. If you send those to the Matrix, then you can chart the." I was like, "Oh, my head explosion! I can use 5 aux for each band, and I don't have to chart all those knobs. I only have to chart the EQ section and the fader position and the mute status, and we're pretty good." So that's really kind of an impressive take. Ben, same question to you. What's in your career some milestones that have made your change your life?
I mean, I'll really reiterate what Josh said about the 3D modeling. I mean, that is like you said, Scott. I can't do a show now without it. I mean, certainly the audience's expectations have increased, and therefore we need to deliver a better product, and that 3D modeling forms part of that. But from there's also the integration and how that 3D modeling, for example, Soundvision, can then feed in and then integrate and link up with other parts of, say, for example, the L-Acoustics ecosystem and all the different parts that feeds into to give you the finished product. So certainly 3D modeling integration, and then from a less technical point of view, I think something which has come on leaps and bounds, particularly recently, is the resources which are available to us all now. Whether that is through things like these webinars or other online resources, or chat pages, forums, or whatever it might be. There's a huge wealth of information out there which we can all learn from, which certainly back in my day wasn't necessarily available due to the technology that we were dealing with at the time. So I think that's played a big part too.
You're completely, that's a really amazing point. And I know I've thought of this before, but to encompass, to remind people that, like, listen, 25 or 30 years ago, you learned the job from an apprenticeship standpoint. So that means if you apprenticed under a good teacher, you did really well. But if you were unlucky to apprentice under a bad teacher, you learned things that were either entirely wrong, were not this or not that, because the knowledge was evolutionary, right? It was, I survived and I did this, therefore this must be right, even if this isn't right, and now we have much more of an education model. There's schools and classes and online seminars and great literature. So it's a really interesting point. And yeah, when I started, that was just in its infancy, and now you look at it and whether it's L-Acoustics or other great manufacturers out there, from the council side and loudspeaker side, whether it's societies like AES, whether it's schools and programs all around the world that teach in this, I think that's something really impressive.
Absolutely.
I think as well, it's worth mentioning, obviously, the situation we're all in now currently is very unfortunate, but this is such a great opportunity for people to learn. There is, as you've said, a wealth of information out there, and a lot of that's been made freely available at the moment, which I think is, we're really, really lucky to have that available to us.
Yeah, it's really sad to miss doing these live performances. It's really, I'm really disappointed to not be sitting at the Hollywood Bowl tonight, having a bottle of rosé and some cheese and crackers. Ben, you've been there before. Josh, I know you've been there before. You know exactly what I'm talking about. It's something I really love to do. I really am enjoying having dinner with the family for this many weeks in a row. It's a time in our life I hope we never have to do again, and yet I'm enjoying every moment of it in that aspect.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Josh, thank you for joining us. Ben, it's great to see you as always. Guys, this has been great. For those of you once again on YouTube, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Ben, your information, your LinkedIn, everything, I'll put that in the show notes on YouTube. Same with you, Josh. Thank you, Britannia Row, for hosting, helping with us as well. Great to see you guys. Be safe, be healthy.
Likewise, Scott.
Pleasure. Thanks, Scott.
Take care.
All right, goodbye, everybody.